Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I think we have a fascinating topic at an incredibly fascinating moment in time with the election right around the corner. And as we look at the divide inside and the challenges of managing through this election cycle in particular, if this is an unclear or contested election, is a question we've been asking ourselves. And so just want to share with you for a minute a hot off the presses set of research that we've done about how large company employees view and their expectations of their employer and leaders in this moment in time. To see that 70% of large company employees expect their leader in their company to be ready to respond if the election is uncertain or contested, I thought was a really clear mandate, as well as the fact that that is bipartisan. Both Trump supporters and the Biden supporters expect that, and it's nearly 83% of people who are 18 to 24 share that expectation. Specifically, there's a sense that companies and their leaders should focus on the process and not the outcome in the topics that they speak out about. And they expect that 65% of employees expect their leaders in their company to speak out regularly internally, daily, if not weekly on the topic. And the downside risk on this is significant. Nearly 40% of people that we spoke to would protest either in social media or otherwise in the workplace if their employer doesn't handle this topic well. In fact, nearly 50% of people who are in that 18 to 24 cohort would protest. On the flip side, nearly 50% would advocate when you do, and I'm sure you will, handle this moment well. So there's real upside in staying true to your values, true to your employees, true to your vision. I think where it gets even trickier, and this is going to be part of our discussion today, is how does this translate externally? And here's where we find, both from an employee perspective and from the general population, there's an expectation of and a sort of limited permission set, that nearly 65% of the people that we spoke to are not advocating for their company or any company to take a public stance. So we'll talk a little bit about these dynamics, as well as just a broader view of how to navigate through these coming weeks and how to lead following. I'm going to pass it now to Sydney Roach, who heads our employee experience group. And Sydney, over to you.
Thank you so much, Russell, and thank you to the amazing panelists that we have gathered today. We hope that they'll be able to ask and answer some of your most pressing questions about this election and how you communicate about them and how you take a stance inside of your organization. So I'm very, very pleased to have Ben Ginsburg with us today. He is the leading expert in election law. And as a partner in Jones Day, he represents numerous political parties, campaigns, candidates, members of Congress, state legislatures, governors, and corporations, all who participate in the election and political process. And he represents a variety of those clients on election law issues, specifically campaign finance, ethics, election administration, redistricting, and election recounts and contests. Prior to Jones Day, Ben served as a national counsel to both the Bush and the Romney campaigns, and he recently served as a co-chair on the Presidential Commission Commission on Election Administration. So we're very lucky to have him with us, with the elections just a few days away. Dane Holmes is a co-founder and CEO of Escalera. He actually founded Escalera, but it was based on his 19 years at Goldman Sachs, where he served as a member of the firm's management committee and partnership committee, and where he led Goldman's HR division. It was there that he was really prioritizing leadership development, diversity, and the employee experience. And in doing so, he really identified a lack of data to drive decisions around culture, particularly D&I culture, which led him to found Escalera to help organizations elevate their people in a more inclusive environment. And Jamil Zaki is a professor at Stanford University. He's a professor of psychology and the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab And one of his many talents is he authored a book last year called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World. And there he shares very powerful and practical advice on exactly how empathy works and how it can enhance company culture, foster collaboration, and lead to more loyal employees. You can find his writing on these topics in the Harvard Business Review, the Washington Post, New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining. And we have so much to cover. I'd like to dive right in and first set the context and start by talking about the moment in which we're operating. So Ben, I'm going to go to you first and say, you have studied constitutional law and electoral politics for years. How is this moment different? Are there any moments in history to which it compares?
Well, we have elections every 4 years, but this one is qualitatively different. We're in a time of pandemic. We are a polarized nation, which is part of an elongating trend, but is certainly culminating now. We're at a time where there's racial unrest in the country as well, and some economic upheaval that I know many of the folks on this call are feeling. And in terms of the elections itself, this is qualitatively different given President Trump's rhetoric. Never before has a president of the United States suggested that our elections are fraudulent and the results rigged. I know from having worked for the Republican Party for close to 4 decades, there's not the evidence to back that up, but all of that makes this very different. And the polarization means that whoever wins on Tuesday or in the aftermath of Tuesday, some of your employees and some of your customer base are going to feel like they've gotten kind of a gut punch. And so I look forward to discussing more of that, Sydney. I'm not sure there are any comparative moments in history. The election of 1876, Hayes-Tilden, was a very contentious election that went to a prolonged stalemate in the Electoral College and sort of a bad compromise to get it done. That's not likely to where we're going to end up now. 2000 in the recount, which is what is in most of our memory banks, was not really this. That was an unexpectedly close election. We don't know yet whether the results anywhere are going to be like that. So this is more animated by the onslaught of absentee ballots and the fact that we have unprecedentedly high turnout, it appears.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm sure we're going to have follow-on questions about that when we enter into a conversation around looking at different election scenario. But for now, we'll go back to Jamil. I wanted to ask you, you wrote earlier this year about the role of the CEO as Chief Empathy Officer. And in this election season, we've seen wildly divergent actions from CEOs, from Coinbase's CEO banning political discussion altogether, to Expensify's CEO sending an email to all of his clients urging a vote for the Biden-Harris ticket. In such a hyper-partisan world, what role does empathy play? And how would you say it's missing, if that's not too obvious a question?
Well, I think that empathy is really an organizational superpower at any time, right? And when leaders demonstrate empathy, they build, as you were saying, morale, loyalty, and community among their teams and employees. It's never been more important than now that leaders make sure that the different people in their organization feel heard and seen. But importantly, that has to mean everyone in the organization. And there's a lot of ideological and political diversity. That is a form of diversity. And I think that it's a form of diversity that requires a sense of inclusion. My lab just published a study last week where we scanned the brains of conservatives and liberals while they viewed the same information about immigration policy. And we found that they had divergent neural responses that predicted what they saw. Right? They were literally seeing different material out of the same ads and same political messages. I think it's important to remember that in real ways, our employees are living in different worlds, different realities, and those must be respected to the extent that we can. So, some tips for that, I think, include transparency. So I don't think that leaders need to send partisan messages. I also think that they need to understand that their employees might want to voice their own perspectives. And there's a way, I think, to split that difference by leaving room for employees to be themselves and express themselves, but also by focusing messaging from leadership, not on a partisan message, but rather on values that are shared by the entire organization.
Really, really fascinating research. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's breaking news. Dane, your research has determined there are really 4 pillars of inclusion. So voice, I think you said, trust, growth mindset, and belonging. And how can employers leverage those pillars to create a sense of inclusion in this post-election environment?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And I would agree, empathy is one of the pieces that helps drive your practice of all of those behaviors. I think, a medicine to bipartisanism is inclusion. And I want to be very clear about how we define inclusion, because sometimes it gets, I think, defined in a wrong way. Inclusion, as simple as it sounds, is about including everyone. So you can't have exclusionary practices and claim yourself to be inclusive. And so what that really means from a behavior perspective, when we talk about trust is, believing that people are going to support you. If you think about that in an organization, I'm going to support you regardless of what your view is, that I'm here to support you generally. Belonging is that people have your back, to use it in the most normal perspective. So that even means that in many cases, the behavior you demonstrate is a behavior that sounds something like, while I may not support that point, I support them making it. And you can support someone through disagreement, and that's how that behavior can exist. And you see that happen when people shout someone down and somebody steps in and says, well, I don't agree with the point being made, I agree with the person's right to make it. And so those behaviors, voice is a huge one, and it's one that was touched on, I'm sure we'll spend time on. You have to allow people to express themselves, and if you don't, I like to use the phrase that water will find its resting place. And if you don't help direct it to its resting place, it will go most likely where you don't want it. And so I tell organizations, give people venues and mechanisms to have self-expression in that part, to give them give them voice. And belonging is the output of all those things together. But in all this, these are the core parts. The one thing that I will say about them that's so important about it, and to not look at this as a crisis would be one thing, to not look at this as a negative situation. This is an opportunity. Doing all those things well makes organizations better. It's not about addressing a particular moment, which of course we're talking about this moment in time. It's that if you learn and develop those muscles, what you're really developing is high performance muscles, things that make you as an organization more resilient, more innovative, more productive, et cetera.
I love that philosophy of your approach, that inclusive behaviors are essentially high performance behaviors. Okay, so we've established some context around this moment in which we're operating, and let's go through 3 scenarios. So the first would be an electoral outcome is extremely close, a certified victory is not clear for either presidential candidate, and no one is conceding an election or claiming victory. So Dane, let's take you back to your CHRO chair at Goldman, and how would you think about employee sentiment during this time? How would you manage communications with employees?
Yeah. Well, the first thing we got to go in, and I'll be, grabbing some of Jamil's, and I figure my role in this is always going to be generally agreeing what both Ben and Jamil say, because I'm just excited to be included on a panel with both of them. But the first thing I would take into any conversation is understand that your employees are already overwhelmed from a cognitive load perspective. So they do not have the space for the traditional view of a super analytical approach, a multi-tiered plan. It has to be simple. It has to be easy to engage with. They are at their wits' end from a cognitive load perspective. So what that will often lead you to then doing as an organization is going to the things that already exist within their memory and their hardware. hey, this is what we are about as a company. These are the things we've always believed in. This is the mission we had before COVID, before racial unrest. You have to take them back to what I would call those kind of foundational touchstones, and then direct super easy ways for them to participate in them, right? So I think that that's what you have to do. What you can't do is put a lot of burden on them to respond. And so for me, for every organization, that'll be different. But it's like, how do I reinforce those things? In particular, how do I find the ones that I know are quite universal and quite shared in the organization? And really amplify those and double down my actions on that front. So that would be my biggest thing. Don't overwhelm them. Try and create certainty with them by giving them foundation, and make their ability to access and understand what's going on super easy. Right?
That's fabulous. Avoid that cognitive overload. I'm not going to ever forget that. Thank you. Jamil, in this environment of prolonged uncertainty, how is that likely to impact employees psychologically? What's the empathetic executive, for example, doing in this moment?
Yeah, I think it will impact them negatively, psychologically, to put it simply. You know, 2020 has already been a crisis layer cake, basically, right? And we're still living through many of those crises. You know, Dane rightly, and I feel like I'm just going to be agreeing a lot as well, but Dane rightly points to cognitive overload. Let's not forget that there will also be emotional overload that many people are experiencing now. And if you add this layer of deep uncertainty about the future of the country onto that, then I think that will intensify that form of overload. There's going to be chronic stress, there's going to be anxiety, potentially depression. I mean, these mood disorders are already 3 times to 3.5 times as prevalent now as they were 1 year ago. And that's especially true among adults who are under 29, who now have rates of depression and anxiety that are over 50%. Right? And so if we imagine that escalating even further in the weeks to come, we really need to understand that there might be there is a mental health crisis on our hands, but it might become an overwhelming mental health crisis. Now, what do we do about that? Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that it's there and to talk about mental health and well-being as leaders. I think an empathic leader in this moment uses that language openly and maybe vulnerably talks about their own struggles without couching that in a partisan way. I think another thing is to understand that oftentimes stress, anxiety, and depression don't show up like that at work. They show up as disinterest. They show up as underperformance, right? I think that we need to, as leaders, be mindful of that, intentional, and really cut our teams some slack during this moment, right? It's simply not going to be a regular time. And no matter what we do, we'll be sending a message. And if we don't send a message, or if we send a message that we expect everyone to perform as typically, we actually are sending a very strong and unempathic signal to our teams. And then the last thing that I'll say is that one of the best sort of buffers against anxiety and depression within organizations is a sense of community, right? A sense that people have a chance to support one another. And that, sadly, is what many of us are missing at work too, right? I haven't seen a water cooler in 8 months, right? We don't have those in-between times that are really the lifeblood of our organizations and the communities that they're allowed to build. So I encourage leaders to make formal time for informal communities. Right? If you have a 30-minute meeting, make it 40 minutes and spend 10 minutes just checking in with people. Again, not about their opinions necessarily, but just about how they're feeling and how they're doing. Or you can generate more formal employee support programs and things like that. So yeah, I think mental health needs to be paramount in the mind of any empathic leader right now.
Yeah, thank you for providing those statistics on mental health. Those are going to be really helpful for our audience, I think, when they have to make some tough decisions. Ben, I want to ask you about this first scenario. If this most likely scenario and election outcomes hinges on lagging results from a few key states such as Florida, how long do you think employers will have to manage some degree of uncertainty? In other words, do you have any indication or prediction about how long such an undetermined election result might last?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is no certainty in this, but we can assess some probabilities really based on history and what's happened in the past. This is not a normal election night. There are a lot of absentee ballots. Folks who want to be able to go to bed at midnight on election night, knowing who the winner is, are probably going to be a bit disappointed. But in our history, we really do normally know the winner in fairly short order. So given the different voting patterns, that may, I think, most likely by the Friday after the election, there will be some very clear patterns about who's won, even if the results don't get certified and become official for a number of weeks. Because of the way certain states are counting absentee ballots, and that's really among the battleground states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They're the outcome determinative states. This is going to take 2 to 3 weeks to be able to have them able to tabulate all their absentee ballots. But in terms of this going to a formal recount or contest, I'm going to put the chances of that at 5.2%. Why? Well, we've had 57 presidential elections in our history. 3 of them have gone to some sort of recount or contest. So there's about a 5.2% chance of it happening this time. And because of the tumult that's been created about the counting of all the ballots and challenging of ballots and the fraud, there is a possibility that a very small possibility, I think, of us getting to a stage where by December 8th, the safe harbor for the Electoral College, there are some states that don't have final results, haven't certified who the winner of their states is. And that's where we get into the really interesting sort of constitutional issues. The Electoral College meets in every state on December 14th. That's a cutoff date. The next cutoff date is January 6th, when the US House opens the envelopes from the states and tallies up the Electoral College. If nobody's above 270 votes at that point, we are in uncharted and uncertain constitutional territory. And one thing you do know from the Constitution is that on January 20th at noon, the current term of the president and vice president expire. And so if there's not an answer by then we're certainly in uncharted territory. But I think the odds are that we will have a clear indication of who's going to get sworn in on the 20th by a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after the election.
Thank you so much for breaking that down and for including some of those swing states. I think that that really will make a difference on how we're able to manage the employee mental health, and will really help our CCO clients understand how they have to frame their messaging and the timing and the cadence, et cetera. So I'd like to think about scenario number 2, which would be a Biden certified victory, but the current president does not concede and refuses to transfer power. So Russell, I'm going to throw this one to you because I want you to think about both your client counselor hat and as our own CEO. You know, how would you approach this with our team? Thinking, again, as we were discussing just earlier today, that sometimes when you advocate for election integrity, that could be interpreted as something political and partisan. So, Russell, could you give us your best advice on this scenario?
Yeah, look, I think as we've talked about before, a big part of our responsibility is to make sure, as leaders and with our clients, is that people feel safe within their company, and also that there's a sense of calm. And so part of our responsibility, you know, within Edelman and with Edelman clients is to make sure that those employee populations know that context for the company that they're a part of, the community that they're a part of, and that their future is still something that they should feel confident in, and that the company is still going to be standing by the way it has conducted itself to date. So for us, whether it's about the importance of voting and standing your ground around voting now and into the future, and around advocating for making sure that the process is followed. And I think in keeping people calm is, as Ben has explained, is that there is a process that the government has to work through this, and that we would advocate to make sure with our clients that they are counseling their people that they are going to be supportive of that. So I think there's a balance there that's going to get really tricky because, you know, as I said before, 65% of people are not looking for their employer to get out in front. At the same time, 70% are expecting you to make sure that you're clear about where you stand within your organization and what it means for them.
Thank you, Russell. And I can tell you that Russell has done a very fine job in keeping us apprised on and creating an amazing Get Out the Vote program for Edelman. So we're greatly appreciative of that. Speaking of Ben being able to help us understand the process, Ben, if there is a Biden win with no concession scenario unfolding, how does it get resolved? Are there any other examples of this in U.S. history?
Not on the presidential level, but concessions are not part of law. They've become really a custom in the last century or so. What is certain in the law is that January 20th date at noon, when the president's term expires. I mean, at that point, if we get to that drastic a situation, I would expect that the leaders of the president's own party would go to him and say, you gotta follow the traditions of the country. But failing that, a term ends on January 20th at noon. So the powers of the presidency, ranging from the nuclear codes to the ability to sign legislations or grant pardons, terminates. And there is a process in the law for what happens should the presidency become vacant on January 20th without an electoral college victor. It goes to the Speaker of the House, who is in all likelihood going to be a Democrat. So that's not a great end game if you're trying to play things out. So I do believe that the institutions of the country, as well as the goodwill of the other elected leaders, especially of the president's own party, would come into play and keep up our tradition and history of a peaceful transfer of power.
Thanks, Ben. Jamil, in this situation, many business leaders are likely to have employees who genuinely feel that they've been cheated by these kinds of non-election results. So is there any role for companies to encourage people feeling heard during this time?
Yeah, I think so. You know, in my neck of the woods, we talk a lot about burnout and other sort of psychological fallout of difficult times. I think that in a situation where there was something along the lines of a constitutional crisis or, you know, a difficulty with sort of democracy, you could run into something else, which is moral injury. You know, a sense that sometimes when we feel as though there's something going deeply wrong and we can't contribute, there's a sense of, like I said, moral helplessness, a sense that there's a loss of meaning to what we do because we're not contributing to the most important thing happening during that time. And so I think one thing that I'd encourage leaders to consider is, again, and this gets back to stuff that Dane said as well, you know, how can we give people a sense that they're able to be agents of their own morality and their own values in ways that work for them, right? So giving people space if they feel like they need to organize or take part in something, you know, not as a representative of the organization, but as individuals. I think another thing that I would say, you know, you had mentioned earlier that a leader who talks about we need a peaceful transition of power might be viewed as sending a partisan message. I think that that's not necessarily the case, or maybe that a message can be refined to make that clear. You know, one thing that that we talk a lot about in psychology is procedural justice. When people in power are clear about the reasons that they're doing what they're doing and invite sort of open commentary on it, right? So I think that there is a way to say, hey, from a nonpartisan perspective, there are, and Ben, I really appreciate your perspective on this as well. There are just, there are guardrails on our culture, on our society. And I think that those are things that are universal to making this country work, to making our society work. And so I think that there's ways to send messages about peace and sort of the continuation of our culture without sounding too partisan.
I think one of the things our research has shown is that publicly denouncing violence for sure is a place where leaders can comfortably wade, in particular with their employees, but likely even collectively, publicly.
Yeah, there's a lot of good detail that's forthcoming from this research, which you'll all have access to next week, that gets down into some of the segmentation and sentiment and expectations of employees. And we'll look forward to sharing that with all of you. Let's take a look at this third scenario where there is a certified Trump victory that could lead to social unrest and rioting in cities. We know that some clients and some organizations are already preparing for those different types of scenarios. So Dane, at what point, and someone talked about this earlier about business as usual, at what point does the term business continuity really no longer seem relevant for companies? At what point are the social issues we're facing simply too big to pretend that business can go on as usual?
Yeah, so a couple things on that. And by the way, my mental framework for both scenario 2 and 3 are largely the same. And just to touch on two a little bit as well in this, and I'll have a little edge just to keep us spicy on a Friday with it, is, I think that if we have any case where there is a certified victory and any sort of what I would call disruption, so either Trump's unwilling to leave the office, or Trump win and is certified as the winner, but like the public goes into social protest. I call those both forms of kind of systemic disruption. I think those will be huge moments for a phrase that's been used a lot, but hasn't been tested in a kind of scaled way, which is corporate citizen. And so that citizen part of corporate is going to suddenly come into a big focus. And I do think this will be brand defining for a period. Nothing is permanently brand defining for a period for companies. Because the reality of it is that even if you try and step back, there will be others that step forward, and you will be compared to the others who step forward in whatever direction that is. And you won't be able to mitigate this. This will not be circumstances. We're already seeing you use the Expensify version, versus you're seeing different approaches, and they're being compared right to each other. So I think what will become very important for companies practically is to, one, provide that outlet. I'll throw out one tactical thing that people can do is literally give their employees days off specifically to engage civically. And that could be defined in a very open way, but you can literally add those. It's not a vacation day. It's not a mental health day. It is a civic engagement day. This is what's going on. You can do that. So that's a very tactical one. I think the second one, though, is very much where Jamil was talking about as well, is I would have a war room set up already, separating what I would call fact versus opinion. What are things that we think are fact-based? Hey, we support our electoral process. That is a fact. There's an opinion about who should have won. We're not touching that. But where a lot of these organizations start to get in trouble in these disruptive moments is they start merging fact and fiction from a very individualized perspective. And I think that's particularly dangerous for senior leaders because they are in their own version of an echo chamber.
Yes.
Their employees are in a very different one. And so that ability to become very tone deaf and present something as fact, or this is who we are, or this is what we've always believed in, is at a much, much higher chance of actually tone deafness than you could imagine. So from that perspective, I would have that quote war room arranged and be very clear, right? That this is what we view as factual, that we support 100%. This is what we don't touch, and make sure that that's not a top-down perspective. That in this environment, it's a bottoms-up one.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Was that the edgy part? I don't find that edgy. I think that's very good
all right,
common
the only
sense.
part the only thing that I think is edgy about it is the concept that people think they can pick a middle ground on this is a false narrative. I just think it's I think it's a very false concept to say, I'm just going to stay in the middle. I'm going to kind of keep my hands clean.
Right.
Like, and just, I'm going to bounce the penny on the knife's edge because, I'm a master of the universe. Forget that.
Right.
I think that's a losing failure, but it is the natural instinct that most people have when they go to crisis. This is not crisis. This is kind of an evolutionary, behavioral, societal trend that is happening. And you have to acknowledge the broader trend and not the moment.
Right.
Sydney, can I jump in really quick?
Sure, absolutely.
Dane, I love what I love what you're saying here. It really resonates quite a bit. And I think that to your metaphor of, water will find a place to rest, I think that that's really critical in a scenario, Sydney, like the one that you're laying out right now, right? I mean, people will want to activate themselves as citizens. They're going to do it. And I think the question will be, how is it framed to them? If their organizations and leaders are trying to stop any type of expression at all, then they'll be doing so contra their leaders, right? They'll be thinking of their leaders and their organizations as the suppressive force that they're overcoming, right? And they will, and there'll be cascades of that, right? I mean, when one person steps up and voices their opinion, it will give others peer permission to do the same. And you'll end up with this contagious effect of people stepping out, but again, in contrast to the values that they see their organization as having. Whereas, if, as Dane is saying, you give people days for, let's say, citizenship, and I would add service, right? Just go and try to add value to the culture writ large with these days. You can do it in a totally nonpartisan way. Then you take that same energy and align it with the organization, right? You can create more buy-in, where now I'm engaging with the behavior I find meaningful, and I'm tying that to my role in my company as well, right? I feel like my organization is on my side as opposed to against me.
Right. Fantastic add-on and follow-on. I was just fascinated with what you were saying, Dane, about the media bubbles, and we're all self-selective, and as much as we try to break out of that, we sometimes it's very hard to do that. And so if you think about the workplace, it's one space in our lives where it has become the virtual town hall. Even if we are working remotely, it's still the place where we have to come together, where we are not able to stay in our media bubble. So in that situation, Jamil, for that third scenario, how do you have both that, workplace as the pluralistic town hall, but yet, what can leaders do to keep that sense of calm amidst the crisis? I think you've given really great advice on how to direct that energy so that the water doesn't seek where it shouldn't go, to mix both of your answers. But what can be done to create a sense of calm and stabilization in the workplace?
That's going to be a tall order. Calm is not probably going to be the feeling people would, the first word that would come to mind if you ask people how they're feeling in really any of these scenarios. One thing that I'll say, though, is that, our institutions, our organizations are heterogeneous, right? There are people with different opinions. And one thing that I think is very important to get past is the idea that there are enemies among us, right? And so how do we generate harmony, at least, if not calm? One of the things that social science research tells us that I think is so important and under-recognized, Ben, you made a great point earlier that we are more polarized than we were before. And that's absolutely true. We're also affectively polarized, meaning that people don't just disagree, they fear and loathe people on the other side. But we also believe ourselves to be even more polarized than we really are. I call it phantom polarization. So for instance, if you ask liberals, how do conservatives feel about you? And then you ask conservatives, how do you feel about liberals? liberals believe that conservatives dislike them way more than conservatives really do, and the same goes in the opposite direction. Right? So we're perceiving more hatred than we're actually receiving, but that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if it just turns everyone's threat levels, you know, to DEFCON 1. I think the lower numbers are worse. Then you get reactants, and then you actually end up with people aggressing or feeling fear and anger that they might not actually need to feel, right? And so I think that remembering that we're not as different as we might believe ourselves to be, that we do have common ground, even if the media isn't showing it to us and our filter bubbles aren't showing it to us, it's there. And I think just that recollection or that realization that there's not as much hatred within the organizations, not as much hatred across parties even as we think there is, can be a starting point, maybe not to calm, but at least to turning down the volume a little bit on some of these sort of volatile states.
Yeah, I remember when you shared that data point with me last week, and it reminded me of some Middle East politics, that there had been similar research done there. So I want to go to Q&A now. We have just a little over 15 minutes left, and I think that there's a lot of energy in the audience around questions. So remember, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit, and I will, this question doesn't say to whom it's posed, but let me read it off here and we'll direct it around the group. Do you view it as irresponsible for a large nonprofit who pledges not to advocate for a political party to advocate for a certain side, obviously, but covertly? The entire leadership of our large nonprofit corporation is obviously on the Democratic side because it benefits our healthcare organization. It's uncomfortable for me because I do not align with the values of that party, but it's career limiting to say so. So Dane, I'm going to throw this tough question, and I like the fact that this is a really real question.
Sure.
Dane, I'm going to throw this to you because of all of your years in the HR management, because this is a tough one.
Yeah, sure. So it's so funny part, it's actually in a lot of ways perfect because I actually sit on the board of a not-for-profit that is often viewed as being Democratic leaning, but we're a national organization, and we're actually taking on activities in this moment to kind of bridge the gap. Funnily enough, what I would say is with all companies, I think you have a choice. You have to choose what your value and your mission is, and then you have to live up to it. The concept of not doing it is not a problem. So I would say for this organization and what the insight of it is, hey, we can want certain policy outcomes. Policy outcomes are different than who you elect, right? That is a very narrow, I know, understand people, often vote on one issue or one or two issues. But I would say as an organization, I think to come out for a specific party is a very difficult thing to do. I don't think it's difficult from a practical perspective, but unless you were specifically created as an instrument of that party, you were trying to serve some broader mission, some broader society that should not allow that categorization around. And maybe this one will be a little bit more edgy. That would be like somebody who is who's black at an organization saying, hey, I think I have to support racism
Right.
because, it happens to be aligned with the party that I'm at. But
Shades of Dave Chappelle.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So I think putting people in those positions organizationally is wrong. And I think that if you are in an organization that is overweight to one category, it just builds the pressure on your organization to oversteer to the other one. Because if not, you become an echo chamber yourself, you become ineffective, and you also start to lose your mission. So I would say for the person to put that in, you're the most valuable employee they have because you're counter-normative. And if they're smart, they will look at that value and they will actually listen to you a lot.
Fantastic advice, Dane. I really, really appreciate your candor. We have a question from Meredith Young, and she asked a great question. And you spoke to this, Dane, but I'm also going to send this one to Russell. I'd like you both to think about it. How do you create a war room that's bottom up? Does that mean all voices are part of creating that space? This person said, Meredith says, I know this is tactical, but I'm really not sure how to accomplish it. It's a really good question. So Dane, do you want to jump in and then
I can jump in
Russell?
only because, yeah, I spend a lot of time in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so a lot of time when we talk about that work, we talk about it being cultural change. This is like, you have to accept that what you're actually doing is cultural change. You're not informing. This isn't a subject matter. This is a cultural change event. And within cultural change, when you really want it to work, for it to actually exist, it has to be grassroots. That's one of the great lessons. Yeah. Yes, it's important for it to be top down, but cultural change comes from individuals deep in the organization. The matrices I use to kind of create that cultural change, which we advise our clients on, is you want to create a 9-box grid that looks at people through the lens of doer and believer. Okay. And so you want the believer component of it, because that's the people who basically will take on the extra work, will really commit themselves to it, who also are informed in the complexities of it. So, but when I say informed by the complexities of it, that also means they're practical, right? They understand the passion work, but they're also practical about it. And then ultimately, whenever you want to drive cultural change, and when you think about a war room and how do you get grass ups, you need doers, because there's a lot of people who are passionate about subjects, but don't move the ball forward. And for an organization, you want that Venn diagram. The perfect person is deeply believes in the issue and they're a doer. That person, you want to be part of that war room. And you have them in your organization, and they're actually, which I'm happy to talk about later, certain roles that tend to create people like that, but they're the bridge builders. They're the project managers. They're the people you throw at sticky situations to kind of move the organization forward. And so I would fill the room with people like that. What's interesting about that is that when you usually go after those people, they do not fit a specific demographic. They do not fit a specific role. They tend to be all over the place. So you get a lot of natural spread. When you use that criteria of, do you believe in the subject we're trying to advance, and are you somebody who likes to get stuff done? If you're those two things, welcome to the war room.
Great advice. Russell, do you want to take a whack at that too?
Yeah, sure. I think that was great. I would just add that in the representative set that is making the call, that are making the decisions, you have to plot those seats out in advance. That you want to make sure that that same representative set, who have their ear to the ground from the grassroots, have to be there to inform the decision making. Oftentimes, you won't be able to come to a view that's got peripheral vision unless you set that table in advance. I think the other part that's important to think about is the feedback loops. As you're making those decisions, and once you've made those decisions, you can refine them with additional feedback from those doers, the thinker and passionate doers. And so that feedback loop can also, if you need to course correct, that's the group that can also help you course correct quickly enough. And if you're not going to, make sure they understand why the decision's been made to be what it's going to be, and how they can come to terms with that, oftentimes through dialogue.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Ben, we have a question for you. I'm interested in hearing from Ben how he thinks the courts may react to prolonged protesting if President Trump is the certified winner.
Or if Joe Biden is the certified winner and Trump partisans go out and protest. I think that there will be a great desire by most people in the country, to Jamil's point about the folks in the middle, who will really want the return to a more peaceful life. And I think the courts will be reflective of that. I find it difficult to believe that courts are going to somehow encourage a lot of protest post-election. And I think the more risky role for the courts will be if it's not a clear election outcome. Mm-hmm. And then those are much more difficult cases to adjudicate, and passions will run much higher. When you talk about the courts, it brings up an important point, which is any solution to a fractured society. We tend to think about these as national issues, but in reality, the solutions happen much more on the local level. It is easier to find a solution for a community problem than it generally is to figure out war, peace, and taxes. And that's probably the right place to devote energy, is on the local level.
Why do we always forget that all politics is local? I think it's because it puts more onus on us to act, actually. I think that's why. Jamil, I have a comment from Karen Burke-Hartzmeyer, and she said, Jamil, I love your idea about formal time for informal connections, scheduling extra time in a meeting to check in. Any other concrete ideas? And I'm just going to, before you answer, Jamil, I'm going to weigh in and say, to make a very blatant plug, Jamil and I are working on a practical guide for leaders around empathy. So the practical guide for leadership on empathy with a lot of concrete ideas coming soon. So over to you, Jamil, with the question.
Yeah, and I should put a plug in for Sydney, who's just a great partner in ideation and thinking about these issues. Yes, I mean, I work with organizations and leaders all the time around reforming their cultures to be more collaborative, socially and emotionally connected. And there's lots of ways to do that. You know, these include peer support programs, which can be, you know, sort of anything from just resources that people sort of pool for those who are in need. But also, you know, some of the things that I've seen organizations do that really inspire me are creating slack in people's schedules and then encouraging them to focus time not just on their personal targets, on individual goals, but on collaborative goals. So fostering a culture where people feel as though they can ask for help, and in which they feel as though they are given time expressly to help others with their requests. There are formal ways to do this. So I'm working right now with a client on building reciprocity rings. So these are sort of groups within the organization where people give asks, you know, and it could be asks for help with a project at work, or a sort of hurdle that someone's hit, or it can be personal. You know, I'm having struggles with online learning for my kids. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? And sort of people in the ring are then encouraged to step up and offer help. And again, they're given time and space to do that. None of this can be an unfunded mandate, right? I mean, it has to be given its own room. The amazing thing is that giving it time, giving people time for those collaborative activities pays dividends. I mean, enormously, right? And it's not just through increases in morale and connectedness, it's also in increases in creativity and efficiency. Oftentimes, if we feel as though we're alone in our organizations, we'll bang our heads against the same wall that someone else has already poked through, right? And we won't realize that they have resources that they could spend 5 minutes and save us 5 hours or 5 days. So once you make that time for informal connection, for a more openly and explicitly supportive culture, you actually tap into all of that efficiency, in addition to of course, the moral and emotional benefits.
Wow, that's a very powerful idea. I love this circle. We have a very good and tough question, and I would love for everybody to think about this deeply and raise your hand when you panel, when you want to speak to it. It's a really good question that we actually discussed in our team this morning when we were looking at the new research. So, criticism of writing became contentious because people thought that it was the only way communities could have shown their frustration when they've systematically not been heard. And secondly, we're not as fast to condemn or criticize this systemic violence, but do we when the oppressed group lashes out? How do you respond? So I think it's sort of a two-part question. Think about that one. It's a rich, I love tough questions. This is a tough one. So Dane, are you raising your hand? Okay, have at it.
Because I got this a lot from CEOs reaching out to me early on in the crisis about, you know, their messaging. And so just a couple of things that I'd say. One great documentary that this reminded me of was this documentary called The Fog of War, featuring Robert McNamara, talking about it. And if you remember, for those who've seen it, he talks about the law of proportionality. And this is one of those areas where I say to people, all right, you got to think about your proportionality concepts here, and you have to think about them very specifically to both your language, both in the nature of the language, as well as the amount that you devote to it. So what does that mean? So I say, okay, you had this event where, let's just say, take George Floyd, someone's on his neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and you watch him die. And so whatever level of proportionality of that and what that exhibits, and then you have, protests, many of which are peaceful, you have some which turn violent. Now, when you're writing a note around that, the language you use, the amount of time where you place it, and the amount of time you devote to it signals something to the reader.
Yep.
And so I was telling most people early on that they shouldn't even touch the violent protest, because I just said, for the moment, in the concept of proportionality, address the big proportional moment and proportionality. But even separately, when I had a couple of people who skinned their knee on this, and they said, Dane, I put this statement, I put a ton of time into it. What do you think about it? And I pointed out to a few of them, I'll leave them nameless, where I said, this is the language you used on violence. We condemn violence of all sorts. And you talked about how negative it was for society and the difficult impacts of it. When you referred to George Floyd, you referred to the tragic death of George Floyd. What is the language between condemnation and tragedy? They're different power words, and where you chose to use them and how much you chose to allocate to them speaks something to it. And so I said, I literally think if you'd flipped it, you'd have a completely different response. We condemn the murder of George Floyd, which a lot of people weren't willing to say, right? And we find it tragic that some of these peaceful protests have led to violence. Completely different response. But so what I would say to people in it, I think it's a fact. I think it's all about what people are more comfortable in. People are less comfortable in talking about race. So they tend to use stunted language. They tend to say it less full-throatedly. People have a longer history talking about violence. It's something they're more comfortable talking about, but they have to be aware of those dynamics and adjust their language accordingly. But proportionality in everything everybody does in this environment is really, really important. Like, am I going to talk about the nuanced thing around the election, or the big thing that I believe in democracy? Am I going to, like, how am I going to approach it?
We've actually done exercises with clients where we've visualized that, to visualize the proportion and to understand how different elements of your message need to fit in relation to that. So anybody else want to speak on that question? I think you did a fantastic job, but any add-ons, follow-ons?
Look, I think the other part to think about is also, when is it fitting to be saying anything, right? So there are places where it's the government's responsibility, where it's the nonprofits and NGOs, their responsibility. And as we had said before, the opportunity for your employees, we do something where we call a day of civic action. So you talked about giving people time. We created something this year to give people the time to go and take what action is right for them. I do think there's the proportionality, there's also the proximity. So some of those things really will also drive your actions. So for instance, for one of our clients, PwC, one of the reasons they sort of upped their ante and what they were doing in the diversity inclusion space was because of the tragic and awful death of one of their employees, who there was a raid on their apartment, or actually that they mistook them. I might get the fact a little wrong on that one, but the proximity was so close to them. The same might be if your headquarters are based in a city that is, facing a certain kind of unrest, and it will then depend on the context of that. So I do think that proximity plays a big role, and then judging whether or not you really have a permission to take a stand, and how that fits on where the company has been in the past, and how quickly and how authentically they stepped into their purpose in those moments. So there's a balancing act, but that is also, I think, a key calibration.
So proportionality, proximity. Ben, Jamil, you have a third P you would like to add to that? Always good rule of three.
Yeah, I really support what both Dane and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Russell said. Yeah, it seems
I
like
do
they've
as
covered
well.
it well.
And I would not include politics as the third.
Yeah. Two P's that get a yes and one that gets a clear
Exactly.
no.
So my friends, we are at the time of our end of our allotted time. I am so deeply grateful to these outstanding panelists and friends to contribute to this really important dialogue right now. We will have that research available for you next week. We will have the recording of this available for you very shortly. I don't know exactly when, but it usually does not take us that long to turn it around. And I'm so grateful. If you have any follow-on questions, you know how to get in touch with me, and I can disperse some of your important questions to these gentlemen. So thank you, one and all.